Let's talk about the war in Ukraine, because there's been a big shift. You've got Russia claiming to have annexed 4 regions in Ukraine, some impressive gains by the Ukrainian army.
We understand that they are firing at Russian positions about 3 kilometers from here. The tanks operating here are part of a wider counter-offensive in the east that has seen great success in recent weeks.
And then there's what's been going on inside Russia.
Тревожно. Но реально тревожно. Над нами уже начинает издеваться там весь Запад.
Plus, the whole issue of nuclear weapons. But let's start with the annexations. President Vladimir Putin has declared that these 4 regions in eastern Ukraine now belong to Russia. How did that happen? Well, pro-Russian officials in those regions organized referendums and told people they had to vote on whether they wanted to join Russia. When the results were announced, they appeared to show that an overwhelming number had voted yes. But no one was surprised. Ukraine and its Western allies say the whole thing was staged and illegal under international law.
Цей фарс на окупованій території не можна назвати навіть імітацією референдумів.
The so-called referendum was a sham, an absolute sham.
We have multiple accounts of people with guns, Russian soldiers, or local pro-Russian militia going door to door and forcing those who didn't flee to vote.
Putin went ahead and put on a big show in Moscow to formalize it all. This is him with the 4 pro-Russian leaders of those Ukrainian regions.
Они сделали выбор быть со своим народом, быть с родиной.
But the thing is, Russia doesn't have full military control over those regions. Actually, it's been losing ground fast. Ukrainian forces have made major gains in the last few weeks.
The Kremlin now controls less of those regions than it did when the votes were held.
The Ukrainians, as you say, are on a roll, and they think that they are pretty much unstoppable at the moment.
It's what people mean when they talk about Ukraine's counteroffensive. They essentially tricked the Russians into thinking they were focusing on the south, but instead they attacked in the northeast.
So Ukraine's counteroffensive is definitely a turning point. This heavy equipment that the West has sent, that the Washington and the British government in particular have sent, has been a game changer, and there's been an element of surprise that's benefited them as well.
This counteroffensive was extremely important. It raised Ukrainian morale. It showed that Western arms are working, that Ukrainians know how to use them, and that Ukraine is actually able to win this war.
So there's a real sense right now that military momentum is on the Ukrainian side, and they're still pushing. So here's where we need to look at what's going on in Russia and President Putin's response to all this. He announced a partial mobilization that basically means the government calling up more men to join the war in Ukraine, another 300,000 of them.
Призыву на военную службу будут подлежать только граждане, которые в настоящий момент состоят в запасе.
But it didn't exactly pan out that way. And when the draft orders were sent out, there were all sorts of issues, including men without military experience being told to go and fight. Protests sprang up across the country. Flights out of Russia were all booked up. And long lines started to form at the international border crossings. One estimate suggests 260,000 men have left Russia to avoid being sent to war.
Я бежал от мобилизации. Я не хочу умирать за режим. Я не считаю его правомерным. В общем-то, он преступен.
Even some commentators on state TV, who are usually very supportive of Putin, have been openly critical of how the mobilization is being handled and how the war has been going.
Каждый идиот на местах, который решил то, что можно взять какого-нибудь музыканта, либо человека с миллионом болезней, должен быть не просто наказан, а его бы хорошо в строевые части и первым на фронт.
So what could this mean for Putin? Well, it's hard to say. but we do need to be careful not to overstate the level of criticism inside Russia.
Anti-war protests are very low. All in all, in 2 weeks, there were something like 4,500 people only that took part in anti-war rallies, and at the same time, nearly 2,500 of them were arrested. What we see much more is what we call kitchen protests. So people are sitting on the kitchen and discussing between themselves how bad the situation is.
Look, regime stability comes down to who has the guns, and Putin and his guys still have the guns. He controls the security apparatus, and he's not going to let that go.
But the fact that more Russians are asking more questions and people on state TV are arguing the Russian military needs to do better, well, that is a shift, and it only adds to the pressure on Putin.
In the beginning, absolute majority of our population were thinking that this war will last 2-3 weeks. The country psychologically was not prepared for a long war. And this is the key factor now, because people don't understand why there are no victory, why there is no Russian flag over Kiev.
Now, hanging over all of this is the huge question of nuclear weapons and whether President Putin might use them. Since the beginning of the war, he's been hinting that the option is on the table, and he did it again when he signed off on the annexation of those 4 Ukrainian regions.
Мы будем защищать нашу землю всеми имеющимися у нас силами и средствами.
And those annexations have really ramped things up, because from Putin's point of view, any attack there is now considered an attack on Russian territory.
And according to the Russian law and according to Russian nuclear doctrine, attack on Russian territory should be with a heavy strike back.
In other words, it could be met with a nuclear strike, at least in theory. And in that scenario, most experts think we'd be talking about a tactical nuclear weapon, and more likely, the lower end of the explosive range for those weapons. To give you an idea, it could be similar to what we saw in the 2020 Beirut blast, only with radiation. But for the West, this is the ultimate red line.
We have communicated directly, privately, at very high levels to the Kremlin that any use of nuclear weapons will be met with catastrophic consequences for Russia, that the United States and our allies will respond decisively, and we have been clear and specific about what that will entail.
We are conveying the clear message that this will have severe consequences for Russia and that the nuclear war must never be fought.
So would Putin even go there?
I think he's going to face so much discontent at home that he's going to force himself in a corner, and he's going to become increasingly erratic and emotional, which we're seeing already, and he's going to seriously consider using a nuclear weapon. I think that's where we're going.
I cannot exclude 100% such kind of situation when only tactical, of course, nuclear weapons can be used, because if for victory such kind of step will be needed, it might happen. The problem for Putin that he needs only military victory over Ukraine. Defeat in this war will be defeat not only of him, will be defeat and the crash of the whole political system.
So any kind of negotiated end to this war seems completely out of the question right now. In fact, we're expecting things to step up before winter sets in.
The weather temperatures are getting quite cold, and it's going to slow down men in tanks and supply lines. So most analysts and people on the ground say, the next 2 weeks are quite crucial in terms of where things stand on the battlefield.
For Ukraine right now, the goal is to gain as much land as possible till somewhere around mid-November, maybe late November. And then for the next 3 months is going to be a war of attrition, just troops standing next to each other, waiting for combat to resume somewhere in late March.
In case you missed it, check out our last episode about the elections in Brazil. And don't forget to subscribe to Al Jazeera's YouTube channel so you don't miss our next one. See you next week.